And so I'm particularly going to focus on psilocybin, kind of for personal reasons, because it's what's really interesting to me, but it's also some of the most robust research that we have right now for the treatment of mental health disorders. And so when we're referring to psilocybin, most of you might know this, but if not, just a brief refresher, it's mushrooms, also called magic mushrooms. It's a classification of psychedelics, also known as entheogens. And the language is really important here because, as Kiana was saying, destigmatization is a really huge part of how we are accessing these substances as treatment, as we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about policy. But it's important to note that there are historical traditions in multiple parts of the world utilizing psychedelic or mind-altering substances that are producing like spiritual, mystical, and hallucinogenic effects. Some of which you might be familiar with: Iboga in Africa, Datura in some Native American tribes, and here we sit on Chumash land at the UCSB. Ayahuasca in Central and South American cultures, but this is really a phenomenon of humanity across history and across different locations. And so when we're talking about this, these psychoactive substances and their utilization across history, we're really talking about the utilization of them for religious and spiritual, ritual, healing, and intellectual purposes. And so I think this is a really important distinction because there's a lot more going on to these experiences than just, let's take some mushrooms, let's talk about the experience with a therapist, and then poof, I'm healed and all of my symptoms are gone. Right? There's so much more that is encapsulated in the experience of psychedelics or any other mind-altering experience that makes up what's happening. And I think it's really important to highlight that as we continue on with research in this field. So psilocybin in the West, it is an indigenous plant to US, Central, South America, and Mexico, found in most parts of the world. It was suppressed by the Spanish conquest in Mexico. It was used indigenously for many, many years, and then excuse me, was driven underground, which I'll distinguish what underground means a little bit later. But in 1957, we have a woman called Maria Sabina, who was a curandera in Oaxaca, which is a southern region of Mexico. And she opened up the ability for Westerners to come and partake in these sacred ceremonies that included ritual and chants and prayers while ingesting psilocybin. And so she invited someone called R. Gordon Wasson to be the first person in the US to come down and have this experience, this more shamanic type experience with psilocybin, and then came back to the US in 1957. And psilocybin really hit the stage with this Life article, front page magazine, great adventures in the discovery of mushrooms that cause strange visions. So it subsequently became illegal and restricted under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, but this was a direct result of the research that was going on in this time period between the 1950s and 1970s that was really championed by researchers and mental health professionals. And so this time period is often referred to as the golden age of psychedelic research. And so some of the most notable figures of this time are Dr. Albert Hofmann, who some of you might be familiar with. This was a Swiss chemist who accidentally got himself very, very high one day, and in doing so, created LSD. Dr. Hofmann is also a really important figure at this time because he was disseminating psilocybin and LSD and other substances to clinicians and to researchers across the world, really encouraging people to utilize them for mental health treatment and research. And then we have Harvard psychologist, clinical psychologist Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary had some infamous experiments at Harvard, notably the Concord Prison experiment, and then the Marsh Chapel experiment, which later became revived in the 2000s by Roland Griffiths, which I'll get into a little bit later. But this was shut down for ethical reasons because Timmy Leary, good old Timmy Leary, was popping some psilocybin, giving it to his students, and was really crossing ethical boundaries with clinical trials. So that was shut down. But he is still really known as a prominent figure and very influential of this time. And then we have Dr. Stan Grof, who is the founder of holotropic breathwork, which is kind of one of the most utilized and taught and facilitated alternate state of consciousness outside of a psychedelic experience, utilizing the breath, a hyper-paced breathing experience to elicit that psychedelic-like experience, but it's actually a little bit more controlled because you're not fully under the influence of a substance. You're still kind of awake, but not awake. And so it's a very fascinating experience that I've been playing a lot with, both clinically and privately since 2015, but Dr. Stan Grof was a prominent figure in non-ordinary states of consciousness research and methodology. And then we had Terence McKenna, who was the philosopher and mystic who studied shamanic practices pretty extensively and taught about them and wrote about them here in the US at this time frame. And then Dr. William A. Richards, who is still around, who was interested in the treatment of alcoholism and end-of-life anxiety amongst cancer patients, which that research was also revived, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And so during this time, it has been purported that over 1,000 clinical papers were published in literature discussing the experiences of 40,000 patients treated with hallucinogens. And so at this time, the research was really focused around the treatment for alcoholism, psychosomatic disorders, PTSD, OCD, and death anxiety in cancer patients. And so a meta-analysis that was conducted in 2012 of the RCTs that were happening at this time. RCTs are randomized control trials. They're kind of like the gold standard for intervention or treatment research that in this time period demonstrated clinically and meaningful effects, which persisted up to 6 months after just a single high dose of LSD. So this is a pretty meaningful finding, that we have even just one single dose having persistent kind of positive outcomes up to 6 months after. All right, so it's really impossible to talk about research without talking about policy because they're so intrinsically linked. Some of you might know most of this, but if you don't, here in the US, we have the scheduling system by the DEA, and the scheduling system basically is categorizing substances based on the DEA's purported their medical value and their drug's potential for abuse and lack of safety under medical supervision. And so these parameters surrounding the schedule system are on a scale. And so the 1 is the most harsh, and most psychedelics are actually within this category, psilocybin being in this category as well, and then 5 being the least harsh. And so a harsh schedule doesn't necessarily mean that a drug is totally illegal, right? So criminal laws, although they're guided by the scheduling system, they often take other factors into account, for example, with cannabis, which is less punishable, especially now at the federal level, even though it's still considered a Schedule 1. And then opioid painkillers is another example, which are Schedule 2, which is kind of on the harsher side, but they are legal for medical purposes, right? So it's important to note a few things here. Number 1, that it is absolutely a cultural component to how a drug, there's a cultural component to how a drug is perceived, right? So is it a drug? Is it dangerous? Is it a medicine? Is it a sacred plant? And the government's history of restricting indigenous and other practices. The other thing that I really want to highlight is when thinking about the legalization and decriminalization of psychedelics and other medicines, we really have to take into account who is benefiting and the repercussions of the years of damage the war on drugs has impacted, particularly minoritized communities, where we have Black and Brown folks who have been incarcerated and are still incarcerated to this day for cannabis-related offenses and other offenses currently. And yet we can just walk into a dispensary in California very freely and legally purchase and consume cannabis. This is something that one of my colleagues brought up that I think is a very important point. So what does all this have to do with research? So a stricter schedule basically means that the DEA can more stringently limit our access to a substance, the supply of that substance, and subsequently the research that we are able to do on that substance. And so What I really hope to drive home here is there is a connection between the cultural stigma and the perception of these substances that absolutely is affecting policy, that then affects research, and that then affects the availability of these substances for treatment and for healing. Whoops. All right, very, very briefly, hopefully some of you know about this decriminalization, which is very exciting. Decriminalization is basically deprioritization. It literally means the repeal or amendment of statutes which made certain acts criminal so that those acts no longer are crimes subject to prosecution. And so there's an important distinction between decriminalization versus legalization. These are two very different things. And then the federal versus the state laws and jurisdiction. And though they might be decriminalized on the federal level and the state level or within whatever jurisdiction. And here we have the places in which psilocybin has been decriminalized. As you can see, this is very recent and follows very similar pattern to what you might all recognize from cannabis as well, right? The slow rolling movement of decriminalization that then creates momentum for legalization. We're absolutely seeing that with psilocybin right now. And so in November of 2020, the state of Oregon became the very first US state to both decriminalize psilocybin and also legalize it for the therapeutic use of mental health treatment in a ballot that was passed in 2020. This is super, super exciting. So Oregon, it is legal to utilize this medicine for therapeutic use. It's great. And it's not just psilocybin. The Entheogenic Plant and Fungus Policy Act of 2020 that went into effect in 2021 in Washington, DC, decriminalized mushrooms, ayahuasca, and mescaline, making arrests for their possession or use the lowest priority amongst police. So this is all very, very exciting. So this is a guy called Rick Doblin. He did a pretty awesome TED Talk, but he is the founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, what some of you might know as MAPS. If you don't know what MAPS is, it is the largest funder of psychedelic research in the world. So they have funded and conducted numerous studies, particularly on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and the treatment of PTSD. And they've actually gone so far as to create a manual for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and they're kind of working towards training therapists right now, particularly working with MDMA because they funded and were able to publish studies related to MDMA. Yeah, go MAPS. All right. So in 2018, 2019, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation for studies of psilocybin in depression disorders. And so the utilization of psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, has been utilized since the 90s, but even before that, since the 50s, 60s, 70s, by therapists and other facilitators that are able to get their hands on psilocybin and able to administer these with clients. But this is definitely on the underground. You find this a lot in the San Francisco Bay Area. But there's been a slow rolling explosion in the psychedelic research interest for the treatment of psychological disorders such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety, amongst others. And so the most robust research that we currently have, and I say robust pretty lightly because we are still in the early stages of research, but nonetheless, right now we have some pretty interesting research on MDMA treatment of PTSD and psilocybin and treatment of depression and anxiety. And so this was a headline from the New York Times a few months ago. The psychedelic revolution is coming. Psychiatry may never be the same. Universities want in, and so does Wall Street. This is a great article. I highly recommend it. I just thought it was very interesting and showing kind of what the cultural climate is, how it's shifting right now. And so tons of money is being poured into research regarding psychedelics, and current research is being conducted at the following institutions. We have NYU, Johns Hopkins, Yale, UCLA, UC Davis, UC Berkeley, We even have a project on psychedelics law and regulation, if you're interested in more of the policy side of psychedelics at Harvard Law. And so I give this to show that this is really happening. We're in this stage of this big revolution, but we are also, I say revolution kind of lightly, I mean like we are in the beginning stages of a ton of money being poured behind a lot of what could be very promising research. And so I say this to get you thinking about places where you yourself, if you were interested in doing any research related to psychedelics, to look at these places, right? But even if you don't have a particular psychedelic kind of project or center on your campus, like here at UCSB, my department, not that I know of, has been doing any research related to psychedelic psychotherapy, but that does not mean that it is not possible to make it happen. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the interesting conversations I've been having with colleagues within my department. But you as a researcher, right, you could bring that to your campus, particularly if you're interested in doctoral studies at all. You get to kind of do your own research, right? And within my department, I've had quite a bit of enthusiasm and different advisors and mentors kind of just interested, at least, in having conversations about this, which is really exciting. And so this is not to overwhelm you. It's just to show you that since 2011, these are all the studies that I could find related to psilocybin research, which is very, very exciting. The current psilocybin research has been really focusing on therapeutic potential in alcohol use disorder, addiction to tobacco, depression, and end-of-life anxiety. And so researchers have kind of various hypotheses positing the mechanisms in which we're seeing these outcomes, right? Like, why are we actually seeing positive therapeutic outcomes? But these, some of these have to do with kind of neurobiology. We have some projects going on around how the brain might be changing in the amygdala during processing emotions. But what we can say somewhat definitively is that there are mystical type experiences that are being catalyzed through the psychedelic experience. And that is then correlated or associated with positive therapeutic outcomes. And so in these studies, we see improvements in various aspects of mental health well-being, such as the reduction in anxiety and an increase in the personality domain of openness and of empathy and of spirituality. And so most of these clinical trials are RCTs, as I mentioned, double-blind design, utilization of active control compounds, and most of them, which basically just means instead of placebo, we have the utilization of an active control. So in one group might be having psilocybin treatment, and then another treatment might be, I think one study had ADHD medication. So they're still feeling something, they're just not sure what they might be necessarily feeling. But there has been some criticism to the current psilocybin research due to the fact that it's pretty small sample sizes, with some exceptions, which I'll get into. But there's a lot of reasons for this, most of which being funding. And then I think a lot of people are really interested in microdosing. Some of you might know what microdosing is, some of you might not. Microdosing is basically taking a micro dose, a smaller dose that might traditionally get somebody quote unquote high or change their state, but they're taking it kind of on a regular consecutive basis over a period of time. A 2021 study, I was able to find that after self-administration of microdosing psilocybin for 3 weeks, participants reported expectancy effects. So meaning they had expectations of some lasting effect of the microdosing treatment, and that may have been the factor in which we're seeing those lasting benefits in the patients. And so that's a little bit inconclusive. It's to say, okay, maybe is this placebo? We're just expecting something cool to happen and therefore something does happen. But it's just one study that I was able to find. And so we really need more research on microdosing specifically. So you might be wondering how these trials are being conducted. And so A lot of the research up until recently, as I said, has been privately funded because of all of the restrictions. One big study that has been in the news a lot recently is this Compass Pathways, which is a company in the UK. They're in their phase 2 really large trial. And it's 233 patients, which is a pretty substantial amount of participants with treatment-averse depression. And this, they categorize this as meaning that the participants, sorry, somebody's, I think somebody's, what do you call it? Somebody's not muted. Treatment averse depression, which just means that they tried a bunch of different treatments, wasn't working. And they found a significant difference in symptoms from week 2 to week 6 for a large dose. For a smaller to a medium dose, there wasn't a huge difference, which I thought was a kind of interesting finding. And so most of these clinical trials patients have no prior experience with psilocybin, but in some trials they might have one where the researchers are trying to mitigate any potential adverse effects like bad trips that they might have had. And then they are administering synthetic dosages, so typically in capsule form, ranging from microdoses to very large doses. And an MD is typically the one administering this, but there's a psychotherapist or a trained facilitator there who's kind of walking the participant through the experience. And so what happens if you're a participant for the most part in these trials, but again, there's some variance because it's trials that are happening amongst many different researchers, but for the most part, you are coming in as the participant, you are briefly speaking with the facilitator about what to expect and what to do. And then you lay down in a comfortable position on the couch, you got your headphones on, they're playing typically some like very new agey music. You close your eyes and you just go through the ride. And then you come out the other side. If you need the therapist there, I've heard of some instances where the therapist or the facilitator, you know, might hold your hand if you're feeling really scared or if you're having a catharsis. But for the most part, the objective is for you to have this very internalized experience. And then afterwards, researchers might ask you about the experience. The psychotherapist might kind of go over some things with you again and serve as your support. And then that's pretty much it. And so this paper in 2006 really kind of pushed psilocybin out into the mainstream. Psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. For those of you who have experimented with or have utilized psilocybin, this might not be all that exciting because you might be like, duh. But in terms of like an RCT trial, you know, amongst this, I think this was published and this trial was done at NYU, which is just very exciting that it's becoming more mainstream. I'm really interested in qualitative research. You might not really care, but for me, I found this study to be really interesting in 2017, where they did a follow-up for people who did a study at NYU. These were participants who had cancer and had experienced anxiety because of being at the end of life. And what they found was after a period of time, 70% of the participants rated that this was one of the top 5 spiritual experiences of their life. One participant even equated it to the birth of their child as how significant it was for them. And I find this really interesting because we have some themes that came out of this study that gives us a little bit more insight into what people are experiencing. For example, lasting changes to sense of identity, catharsis of powerful emotion, improved relationships after treatment, the ability to surrender or quote unquote letting go, forgiveness. But also what's an interesting finding is a continued struggle to be able to integrate the experience, which as a clinician is kind of really interesting, right? How are we helping administer this treatment in a way that is integrating the process beyond just the experience? And so what does all this mean for the future of research? So we have to work as scientists to really standardize the treatment that is going to be reliable and valid so that large-scale administration of psychedelic-assisted therapy amongst clinicians is available for people. So myself, as a future psychologist, I may think about how we can optimize the psychedelic therapy room to account for integration of the experience, as I was just mentioning, or meaning making, right? What did this experience mean to you? And sustaining these lasting effects of the experience. We may also think qualitatively related to indigenous practices and cultural practices in plant medicine, healing, and psychedelic rituals, basically accounting for that which we're really losing when we're conducting these clinical trials and they're administered in a clinical setting in a clinical fashion, right? And so we may also think about participant follow-up to investigate what's actually happening for the participants in this experience. And then finally, research related to the ethical boundaries of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So what is or what is not helpful, what is or what is not safe, that is mitigating harm for our patients and clients that are in like such a vulnerable experience. And so for clinicians, we have this kind of underground treatment, meaning the unregulated treatment and administration of MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, ayahuasca, and more that is currently being administered in California and beyond and has been for decades, despite illegality and government restrictions, although there's a lot of gray area here, right? So ketamine, for example, is Schedule 3, and so it is technically approved for medical use. Although again, this is quite a gray area, figuring out licensure on top of legality. There's a lot to kind of figure out when you're acting as a clinician. And so the California Institute of Integral Studies, also known as CIIS in San Francisco, is sort of a hub for training psychotherapists in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. But from my understanding, there's not really any legal protection for psychotherapists administering psychedelics currently, except for in Oregon, which is really exciting, but it's just like it just happened. And so I think we're still, again, trying to figure out what that actually means logistically. But what happens in these treatment sessions is really kind of unknown in the underground, except anecdotally, because it's not above ground, right? So treatment may vary really widely depending on your facilitator and their credentials or their lack thereof. And I really want to make the distinction here between the cultural and indigenous-led practices of administration of these psychedelic experiences, and then psychotherapists, acting psychotherapists, right, who operate under licensure and are administering psychedelics. And so they're really not the same thing. And this is why I personally believe it's really imperative that research and these conversations be had continuously on campuses and in institutions, so we may get these treatment practices above ground and regulating bodies involved to really protect our clients. And so I want to recommend the recent podcast Cover Story. I don't know if any of you have heard of Cover Story or listened to it. I highly recommend it. It can be pretty intense, but very, very worth it if you are interested in this field. That covers extensive history of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct by psychedelic facilitators and psychedelic therapists with their clients, some of whom are very notable figures in the underground and have been operating freely beyond any restrictions and regulations for decades. And so this really must change, and it starts with these open conversations. And so as we come to the end, what does counseling have to do with it, which is my field? I'll talk a little bit about some conversations I've been having with colleagues and mentors here at UCSB. Particularly my personal kind of research thesis, if you will, is really involving shifting cultural knowledge on what mental health and healing looks like and functions as away from a homogenous, dominant, and Western perspective. And so I'm really asking, who are the current and past stakeholders deciding what cultures and perspectives, techniques, philosophies, and spiritualities matter and shape our field at large and shape the way that we're treating patients? And so this movement is once again being led by a homogenous majority, which I think is really important because indigenous and shamanic practices really need to be preserved. And what voices are being heard on the matter matters. So are we honoring the wisdom and the leadership of communities who may have more knowledge on us of these substances? And I think it's very easy for researchers to act out our colonialism yet again, extracting what is considered a sacred medicine for centuries upon centuries of rituals and traditions for our clinical benefit. And so this is really not to say that these medicines shouldn't be utilized widely, because they have across many cultures, and should therefore be accessed by all, but it is to say that we must handle these medicines with integrity and care. And so psychedelic research has the potential to shift our understanding of psychopathology and counseling, and it really challenges our dependence on psychopharmacology and even years of psychotherapy. So the implications of community accessibility to healing, given the nature of the profound effects of even just one single psychedelic experience, are really huge, especially when you're considering the chemical dependence on SSRIs, for example, which are antidepressants, or other medicines. And so I will leave you with this. I'll leave you on a more esoteric final thought. As we shift our cultural consciousness around mental health, around healing and utilization of practices related to plant medicine, mysticism, and consciousness, what can we glean from an individual having an exceptional experience of connecting to nature, plant, earth, land, community, self, connecting to their innate wisdom and insights cultivated from one's own mind and experiences? This is what's happening. You might be catalyzed through psilocybin or other psychedelics or other mind-altering substances, but this is what's happening internally. This is a very internal process. And then the experience of connecting to our common humanity. And so with that, I want to thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was awesome.
Yeah.
If you want to ask a question, go ahead and chime in or raise your hand, whatever you guys prefer. We'll give it a second. Yes, Ellen.
Hi, that was incredible. I really love to see like people in our university actually doing things. That's so great, and it shows, I don't know, that's awesome. But I have a quick question about the clinical side of things, because looking at this, like, it's not an SSRI, so it's not something you're going to be taking for the rest of your life. So because this is like a one-time or a small time period thing, it's not really going to be easy to like market and fund, because people aren't going to be consistently using it. So how do we make it used? Like, how do we make it better in the field from a big pharma perspective?
I mean, that's a fantastic question. How do we, right? Because I mean, it just makes me think about the fact that it's been suppressed for so long, when research was kind of showing us the potential of even just one single experience and these lasting therapeutic effects, right? So it's a great question that I absolutely don't have the answer for, but I think it's a really important one, right? But when we're thinking about clinically, I think where people within the organization, such as MAPS that I was talking about, some things that they have been doing have been like in the creating a manual for therapists to utilize, right? Or standardizing treatment in a way that clinicians can get trained. Having training programs is another way. And so, you know, I'm not quite sure about big pharma particularly, but I imagine that when it gets to that place, that it might even be a situation where we have multiple different sessions going on, because within the trials, this is one thing that's happening in research, but you're specifically talking about clinically, and all we really have that's not within the jurisdiction of an actual clinical trial is what's happening in the underground. And in the underground, a lot of times, almost most of the time from anecdotes that I've researched, is that people are in fact having multiple sessions with their therapists. And so they'll come back repeatedly for 2, 3, 4, 5, however many sessions they want to have, so long as their therapist can get a hold of it. So Yeah, great question. Isaiah.
Good to see you take the stage again, homie. I have to ask, since you mentioned before and this time, the use of tonal sounds as well as music, as you discussed, in conjunction with psychedelics. I'm curious if you know of any more like stress-inducing sounds or music that have been used. For example, if this has been used with exposure therapy, perhaps exploring those ideas in those moments of stress, acknowledging that again, that is a very vulnerable state. So I'm not quite sure how that might mix.
That is such a good observation, Isaiah. I am not surprised. Isaiah is a colleague in the department, another future psychologist. Absolutely. So the underground has been happening historically in terms of administering psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy here, but also in Mexico. There's some pretty prominent Mexican figures who have also been not just conducting psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, particularly psilocybin, but also training other therapists that then came to the US and created the underground here. So one of those prominent figures utilized very intense sounds, like I think screamo music or something, maybe metal music, and to elicit the exact response that you're talking about, almost to bring to the surface those intense emotions or those intense feelings of resistance, whether they be cognitive or within the body, and kind of working through that with the patient or the client in a controlled way, right? So it's interesting you say that, because it absolutely has been done in the underground within the soundscapes and the kind of sound healing that I've been working with. That was a way that I was trained from my mentor in the Philippines, was part of creating a wave to where certain sounds are eliciting different responses. And some of those sounds are not necessarily pleasant, but they're really there to help create an entire soundscape, an entire kind of journey, if you will. So I absolutely would be fascinated to research more about the facilitation of sound plus the psychedelic experience, because even within the clinical trials, there's always sound that's involved. They have their little eye masks on, they got their headphones on, and I'd be very interested to see how that is interacting with some of the effects that we're seeing. Totally.
Go ahead, Alexis.
So about your mentorship type thing. So I'm really interested in the future, like possibly researching psychedelics. And I'm just curious, like, how did you stumble upon that? And then second question is, like, out of the most recent studies, is there like a general trend in what's being studied? Like, is it, I know with like the psychedelic revolution in the 60s and 70s, like there was a lot of emphasis on like discovering whether like spirituality came out of it. Like, is that still an emphasis, or like, are we focusing more on like PTSD, or like what's going on with that?
Yeah, so I think we're really in a phase now of medicalizing the experience, if you will, which I think is pretty common when we're trying to bring things to the mainstream for them to get being taken seriously. There's a huge history of repression of these and of stigmatization. And so I feel like these researchers are really trying to legitimize this research. And so some of that more mystical and spiritual aspect is not necessarily being highlighted in the research right now, which I think is a problem, which I talked about a little bit earlier. I think we do have to look at what is happening spiritually in these experiences. And I don't think that it's one or the other. I think that it's possible to look at the spiritual effects of what is happening in a psychedelic experience or otherwise, and how that is contributing to reductions of symptomology of PTSD, depression, anxiety, et cetera, right? It doesn't have to be an either or. And I'm really interested to see how we evolve as researchers and scientists and clinicians to where we're merging the science and the spiritual. I think it's really important. On your first question regarding how I stumbled upon my mentor, I mean, truly stumbled upon is the answer. Like I started a meetup when I moved to Taiwan because I didn't really know anyone and I wanted to meet people, and that kind of grew. And someone came to my meetup and said, you got to meet this healer. I feel like you guys are just going to get along. And so I started flying to the Philippines to apprentice under him, and the rest is kind of history. But in terms of how people could get involved if they're interested in learning about this, I definitely recommend you checking out the MAPS website, because they are kind of the leaders in standardizing potential treatment practices for potential clinicians. And then CIIS, I mentioned earlier in my presentation as well. It's a school. It is accredited. It's not accredited by APA, which is our accrediting body here at UCSB for, and just across the country for psychologists, but it's certainly a place where you could get trained to facilitate this. And I think we're going to see more of it. I'm hoping that maybe in 5 to 10 years here at UCSB, our department will start to offer this, right? Like that's kind of the point of having these conversations. And yeah.
Yeah. Can you send both of those things that you mentioned to the chat?
Yes.
And then last little thing is, like, I know you mentioned in your presentation, like basically there being a big difference between how we're researching like psilocybin and MDMA and everything now versus like how it's used like with indigenous people. And I guess what is your insight on like what crosses the line with like almost like a cultural appropriation type of thing? Like how do we like give credit to those people with also, but also make it more mainstream and more accessible? Like,
yeah. I mean, I think it's a really important discussion. I don't have the answer personally. It's just something that we have to continue to talk about, right? And I think for me personally, it's about kind of who are the stakeholders, who are the ones who are we listening to in terms of how are we administering and utilizing these substances? Now, the interesting thing is that not all psychedelics have a history of indigenous practice. Like LSD was created in a lab by some white guy, right? So it's not kind of across the board. However, my point is really that we are not the expert. There are people, there are cultures, there are practitioners and tribes and all, across the world, spanning thousands of years, that have so much more knowledge than we might have on how to utilize these plant medicines particularly, right? And so the point is really, can we listen? Can we involve? And the towing the line between appropriation and integration is a really thin line that I personally am still learning what that means. Yeah, but it's a good conversation to have for sure. I see Grace.
Hi, my first question, I'll just ask one so there's time for other people, but I am wondering, when it comes to administering psychedelics in therapy, like what do you tell them to expect, or what would one tell them to expect? Because I remember reading about kind of how what people are told to expect can influence the results.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess I'm curious how that, like, do you kind of try and explain both the dangers and the positives, or I don't know. Yeah.
No,
it's
a really good question, because that it's part of why a lot of the research criteria for becoming a participant for one of these trials is that you don't have a prior experience, because they want you to come in as blindly and naively as possible to really, not alter your potential kind of experiences. I mean, there's even research being shown that like when you go down and potentially do ayahuasca in the jungle, because you're in the jungle and because you're surrounded by plants and you're in the Amazon, your mind is already kind of in that mode, and you're bringing all these different associations to, like, jaguars. People often talk about like seeing jaguars and seeing different Amazonian creatures, right? And so there's absolutely kind of a correlation between what's happening prior to an experience and what you're going to experience within the session. And so oftentimes there's kind of IRB, which is the internal review board, that kind of like, there's certain ethical things that you have to explain. So for example, like this is how much we're going to give you. Although, yeah, so for everyone, it's kind of explaining what's going to happen. This is how much we're giving you. This is how long it might last. They might say something like, try to breathe through the experience. You might experience things that feel really intense for you. Just remember to breathe. Just remember to focus on, that it's not going to last forever. Try to focus on leaning into the experience versus leaning out of the experience, right? To not kind of resist what's happening. So for the most part, they're saying things like that, but they're really, really careful about not altering people's personal kind of experiences. So the interesting thing about that is you have all of these threads of themes that people are experiencing without having any prior knowledge of, that they're all experiencing very similar things. People purport like seeing different beings or having spiritual, mystical experiences that sound so similar. These are people who've never experienced psychedelics before. So there's something really mystical happening. And I think that's a really important part of the experience personally.
Very cool. Thank you for your answer. Okay, I'm gonna ask my other question.
Okay,
Sorry. I was just like, give me a second. I guess just, is there any room in this field for people who don't have psychology degrees, like especially in your work reaching out to minoritized communities? Like, how much space do you think there is for people who don't have those like specialized studies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I forgot to kind of mention it in there, but absolutely, there's so many different ways for people to get involved in this, whether it be through like policy was something that I tried to highlight, or the clinical side, the research side, the policy side, even community administration. Like some of the facilitators in the clinical trials are not actually therapists, they're just facilitators, right? So it's possible. It's certainly possible. I think, when we're thinking about the treatment of like PTSD, for example, or anxiety, it's important to think about what practices we have in place around kind of protecting our clients. That's why we have things like licensure. But certainly, I think it's important when we're thinking about accessibility, how other people could get involved and administer. And certainly it's happening in the underground. There's plenty of people without any degrees who are doing this work. So it's definitely happening. But yeah, I think that there's so many different fields that could get involved in this, because it just spans many different aspects, right? Law, psychology, etc. Dissemination, accessible communication with community members requires people who can talk without all the jargon. True, very true. I love it. Yeah, it's really important.
Hey there. I have a quick question. But first off, I think Isaiah brought up researching music in conjunction with psychedelic-assisted therapy. And you all have probably heard about this guy, but there's a researcher named Albert Garcia Romeo at Johns Hopkins, who's done work with Matthew Johnson and Roland Griffiths and all them, and he focuses on music in particular. So he's a cool guy to look at. My question is regarding the golden age of psychedelics in the US. And I'm just curious, like, what was the research like then in terms of controlling for external factors and sample sizes, and like the general view on the validity of the research then? Because the conception in my mind is that it was just like haphazard kind of.
Yeah.
But I don't really know. And like, what was there good research then that provided a solid basis for the 2006 Griffiths study? Like, what was the rationale for that?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up your intuition is on the right track for sure. I mean, I only know so much about that time period. More of the literature reviews that I've done has been kind of more on present research, but I will say that it was definitely novel, right? It was really talked amongst professionals. It wasn't really on the mainstream stage, because if you're thinking about that time culturally, we're seeing like the war on drugs, we're seeing LSD and cannabis at the time being called marijuana, like just so much stigma around and policy being shifted to bring these substances down essentially. And so it was highly protected, I would say. And I think because of that, you're not seeing the scientific rigor as you were alluding to as you are now, because there was a little bit more freedom to, because it was so unregulated. You know, if people wanted to give you money, you could just do some trials and then call it a trial, right? Throw out your results. And so I definitely don't think, my inclination is that the scientific rigor was not what we're seeing today. But that's not true of all of it, right? The Harvard studies, albeit them failed experiments by Timothy Leary, at the time were quite legitimate, right? They were RCTs, they were a double-blind design, they were an experiment that was in alignment with the rigor that Harvard and Timothy Leary like really adhered to. So, you know, I would say not as much as now for sure. And it was definitely more underground than what we are seeing now. It's still technically, you know, not everyone knows about psychedelic research. It certainly has a long way to go in terms of the cultural climate, but especially at that time when you had so much stigmatization around these substances, that it was very much kind of amongst psychologists and researchers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a follow-up then after that concerning like how the research now seems pretty valid. I mean, some of the places you listed that are doing research are like the most world-renowned places like MGH and, you know, like, holy crap. How popular of a topic is this in your field in counseling? You know, are you like kind of one of the few people that are talking about it?
Any of the other psychologists in this space want to answer that?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Like how talked about it in the field, how known, how, where are we at?
Yeah. So let's just say that I'm currently in a substance abuse and use lab that focuses on minority stress and disparities. And again, we more talk about, and I would say the rest of the field, when we talk about substances, we talk about that in a disordered or dysfunctional way. In terms of treatment and healing, as Nicole's kind of covered, it's known, but at this point, it's not taken as seriously until, as she's mentioned, in the past 5-10 years, where this research is really starting to pick up pace. But again, as Nick has touched on, that's kind of running up against this idea of legality. You know, same thing with marijuana, even though it was recently decriminalized and in some locations legalized, it's still difficult to perform research with that because of this existing stigma. I don't want to participate because I don't want to be tracked down or things like that. So I would say it's a field that really does need to be grown. And the focus is much more on dysfunction than it should be on why this is becoming dysfunctional and how it can be better used for healing.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. So, I mean, if you go to a place like CIIS, which is producing psychotherapists and PhDs, it's not APA accredited. I mean, there's a huge kind of discrepancy between what seems like a very small amount of people who are interested in this, but then kind of on the cultural stage, we see the New York Times article and the Michael Pollan book, right? We have all of these kind of larger conversations happening, but research, as you all know, well, a lot of you know, as you're probably students, is research takes a long time to catch up, right? So it's like, it's still considered pretty novel. There's still a lot of stigmatization because not everyone, I don't even think it's stigmatization because people just don't know. People don't know. They're like, is that legal? is, should I be talking to you about this? And then, I give a presentation like this and everyone's like, oh, let's have these conversations. Cool. I really think that it's more of like a naivete than it is people actively like, no, I don't want to talk about this. I think people are intrigued, at least from the conversations I've had with some of the professors that we have in our department specifically. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was awesome. We're at 7:35 right now, so I'm gonna have to close down, but thank you everybody for coming. And yeah, we really appreciate all of the new faces and familiar faces, and you of course coming and teaching us something new, hopefully about the research that's going on, the history, and what we can do going forward, as students and as young people, future researchers, future psychologists, and all that. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for being here. And please reach out to me at any point if you want more information, or if I said something that you want some more information on. I'm just going to drop it in the chat. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, y'all. Amazing talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.